today's mindful moment. Ever think about how ideas that seem totally at odds with each other can sometimes point to like a deeper shared truth about society? Well, that's kind of what we're digging into today. We're going to explore this idea by taking a look at some source material you've brought in that really tackles this head on. I have to say, you've given us some really interesting stuff to work with here. So our mission is to kind of untangle it all together and see if we can find some of the most insightful and surprising connections within this specific ideology. You know, its roots, what makes it appealing, and how it shows up in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that jumps out right away from these sources is this tendency to embrace ideas that are completely contradictory.
Yeah.
Almost like they're seen as allegorical expressions of some kind of like primeval truth. What's interesting about that is that it actually can hinder intellectual progress.
Oh, how so?
Well, if you already believe that you have the ultimate truth, then the process of learning and inquiry becomes less about discovering something new and more about interpreting that existing truth in a new way.
Right. It's almost like that lack of consistency becomes a strength in and of itself.
Yeah.
You know, it's a sign of some hidden, deeper wisdom.
Yeah.
And this idea is really brought home when we see things like St. Augustine being combined with Stonehenge in this material.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a jarring combination, you know, and it seems to prioritize symbol over logic.
Yeah, exactly. And this resistance to kind of like the evolution of knowledge has implications for how this ideology deals with technology.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So on the one hand, we see in historical fascism and Nazism that they definitely leverage technology for power.
Right, of course.
But the underlying philosophy of traditionalism often sees technology as this corrupting force, something that's pulling us away from these sort of idealized spiritual values. So even when they're praising these technological achievements, their true loyalty seems to lie with this romanticized vision of blood and earth, which is ultimately a rejection of modernity and the Enlightenment.
So it's like a selective embrace of modernity.
Yeah.
It's like they're willing to use its tools when it's convenient, but ultimately their heart lies in some nostalgic past.
Right.
And then running through a lot of these sources is a really disturbing element, which is racism.
Yeah.
It's like this constant antagonism towards intruders, and it appears as a pretty central characteristic.
Yeah.
And, you know, it seems like it often arises from a deep sense of frustration, either on an individual level or even on a societal level.
Yeah.
And historically, this ideology has really found fertile ground among groups who are maybe suffering from economic decline or political humiliation.
Right. Exactly.
But what the material suggests, and this is kind of fascinating, is that there's maybe a shift happening in who this ideology appeals to.
Yeah.
It's potentially now resonating with what they call a new petty bourgeois majority.
Yeah, and that's a really significant shift because it suggests a change in who might be drawn to this kind of thinking.
Exactly, a whole new potential base of support.
Right.
So then the sources dig into the whole idea of perpetual war and the glorification of heroism.
Mm-hmm.
And what they point to is something really interesting.
Yeah, they're essentially saying that this idea of constant conflict and this need for heroes all the time isn't sustainable.
It's impossible to maintain.
Yeah.
And then that instability, they argue, leads to the elevation of power itself as like the ultimate goal.
Yes.
And this rise of machismo, accompanied by the rejection of women as equals and the condemnation of anyone who doesn't fit a very specific idea of sexuality.
Right. And there's this really striking image used, they call it the symbolic use of weapons as an ersatz phallic exercise.
It kind of gives you a sense of a very fragile masculinity that feels the need to assert itself through force.
Yeah.
It's not very subtle. And then there's this really interesting concept of what they call selective populism.
Right.
It's important to distinguish this from how we understand populism in a democratic context.
Definitely. In this version, individual rights take a back seat.
Oh, okay.
The people are viewed as this monolithic entity, and their will is interpreted and channeled exclusively through the leader.
So it's not about reflecting the actual desires of the majority.
No.
It's more about creating this image of popular will that serves the leader's agenda.
Exactly. It's like a manufactured consent.
It's a theatrical fiction. And there's even this unsettling idea that maybe future digital platforms could be used to amplify this, where this carefully curated online sentiment is presented as the authentic voice of the people.
Yeah.
It's a pretty chilling thought, especially considering the media environment we live in.
Absolutely.
So let's shift gears a bit. One of the most fascinating things these sources explore is the complex and sometimes contradictory relationship between religious belief and the justification of violence. I found this section particularly interesting.
Yeah.
Because, the Bible, for many, is a source of moral guidance.
Of course.
But it also contains some really divergent messages, particularly when it comes to how to treat your enemies and the appropriate use of force.
Right. There's this real tension. Like, on the one hand, you have Jesus teaching about loving your enemies.
Right.
And then in other places, he's using some pretty harsh language.
Right, exactly. And then there's the book of Revelation, which emerges as a really crucial text for certain segments of the Christian right.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful vision, often very apocalyptic, describing Christ's return, and with it, divine retribution against non-believers. The imagery is very potent and often very violent. The fiery lake, the birds consuming the flesh of the vanquished.
And the sources really point out the challenge that this poses for mainstream Christians who might focus on the messages of love and forgiveness and maybe overlook or reinterpret these more violent passages that actually hold a lot of significance for the radical Christian right.
It's the danger of what they call selective literalism.
Yeah.
Where certain parts of the Bible are treated as the absolute truth, while others are kind of, contextualized or just ignored.
Right. And I think it highlights the responsibility that religious leaders have to actively challenge and refute those interpretations that could lead to religiously motivated violence.
Yeah.
It's something that the material points to as a serious concern.
It makes you think about the intended purpose of these texts.
Yeah.
Like the discussion around Genesis, for example, suggests that it was primarily meant to convey spiritual truths about creation, not to be a literal, scientific, or historical account.
Right. If you try to read it through a purely scientific lens, you're missing the point.
Exactly. It's not what it's about. And then there's this really interesting bit about the relationship between doubt and belief.
Yeah.
The sources challenge this idea that they have to be mutually exclusive. There's this great quote from Tennyson that really resonated with me. "There lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds."
It's a powerful idea.
Yeah, it suggests that real faith involves questioning and deep conviction, not just blindly accepting things.
Yeah, and I think what the material is suggesting is that true faith lies in believing that life has meaning and in the power of compassion and kindness. These are acts that, especially when extended to those considered enemies, are fundamentally subversive to totalitarian ideologies that try to restrict the scope of moral consideration.
It's a really powerful idea that these individual acts of empathy can actually challenge systems of oppression.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the emergence of something called Christian dominionism.
Right.
So what are the core tenets of this ideology?
Well, the main goal, as it's laid out in these sources, is the establishment of a Christian nation where only Christian perspectives have any real authority.
Right.
And this ideology often draws inspiration from Christian Reconstructionism.
Which is based on R.J. Rushdoony's Institutes of Biblical Law.
Exactly. And this text advocates for a pretty harsh and unforgiving theocratic system.
Yeah.
It basically envisions a society governed by this strict interpretation of biblical law,
Right.
with punishments that would be considered pretty extreme today.
Right. So it's not just about establishing a Christian nation. It's about imposing a very specific interpretation of Christianity.
Yeah, and one of the core beliefs of this movement is that Christians are now the chosen people, having replaced the Jewish people who, according to them, forfeited their place.
Okay. And the legal framework proposed by Rushdoony, it sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, it's incredibly harsh. It calls for the death penalty for a whole range of offenses, not just murder.
Wow.
And some of the things highlighted in these sources are deeply troubling, like the way they dismiss the historical death toll of the Holocaust, and these echoes of Nazi eugenics and their theories about superior and inferior forms of humans.
Really disturbing stuff.
It is.
And then there's this really interesting concept called logocide.
Right.
It's basically like the killing of words.
Yeah.
Where the meanings of words are deliberately changed to fit a specific agenda.
So truth and liberty become prime examples of this manipulation.
Liberty in their definition means obedience to the Spirit of the Lord. It's almost Orwellian.
It really is.
The idea of freedom gets twisted into submission to a particular interpretation of Christianity.
Yeah.
It's achieved through the eradication of any alternative moral codes or frameworks.
And they even criticize the idea of free speech and a free press, saying they're not truly free because you can't legally punish people for lying.
So it's like control becomes the ultimate expression of freedom.
Yeah, it's a very twisted logic.
It's really chilling.
Yeah.
So let's delve into how this ideology actually works to exert control and promote conversion.
Okay.
What are some of the methods they use?
Well, the sources emphasize that they often exploit feelings of despair, isolation, and fear. They draw people into church communities, and then they channel those negative emotions toward a specific political agenda.
It's a very clever way to gain momentum.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that the sources point out that a large number of Christians might actually support this movement passively, even if they don't fully agree with the more radical goals of its leaders.
And that kind of passive acceptance can be very powerful. It allows the movement to grow and gain influence.
It's almost like a silent endorsement.
Yeah.
And then there's the very deliberate tactic of demonizing specific groups.
Right.
They target LGBTQ plus individuals, liberals, immigrants, Muslims, portraying them as agents of the Antichrist.
It's classic othering.
Yeah, it's a way to create this sense of perpetual crisis and to justify oppressive measures.
Yeah, and then there's this kind of historical revisionism going on.
Oh, how so?
They kind of airbrush out their past associations with racist ideologies in order to fit their current narrative.
And then there's this constant rhetoric of spiritual warfare.
His call to arms.
Figures like Pastor Rod Parsley and youth movements like Battle Cry really embody this. They use the language and imagery of battle and violence to mobilize their followers.
And it's interesting because the sources note that the Christian right actually does seem to understand some of the very real problems that society faces.
Yeah.
Even as they exploit those issues to further their own agenda.
Right.
And they actually criticize what they see as relativism within more liberal churches.
Yeah, it's a very strategic way to position themselves as having the only real answers.
So let's talk about the personal stories of individuals who are drawn to this movement.
Okay.
It's really revealing to see what kind of people gravitate towards this ideology.
Yeah.
Often as people who are searching for purpose, forgiveness, maybe some clear moral boundaries, especially after experiencing difficult or chaotic lives.
They're vulnerable, and the movement is very good at targeting those vulnerabilities.
And they have very structured programs like Evangelism Explosion
that provide this very specific process for conversion.
Yeah, it focuses on getting people to identify a pre-conversion experience of suffering.
Right.
And then presenting eternal life as the solution.
It's almost like a formula. Identify the pain, offer the cure, and then emphasize the positive transformation narrative.
Exactly.
And they also use these very specific questions that are designed to instill doubt about someone's salvation.
To make them feel like they need to convert immediately.
Right. It's quite manipulative.
It is.
And they define sin as anything that the church leaders dislike.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty effective way to undermine individual conscience.
And promote submission to authority.
Absolutely. And we see this really clearly in personal accounts like Nikki Pugh's experience.
Right.
She talks about suppressing her doubts, fearing judgment from the community and from God, feeling overwhelmed by this constant Christian jargon. It sounds incredibly isolating.
And the movement actually employs what they call a fear-based model of evangelism.
Which is all about instilling fear before presenting the gospel.
Exactly.
It really highlights the manipulative aspects at play.
And there are stories from people like Helen Freeborn and Juliana Ximleman who were deeply involved in evangelical culture and later became disillusioned.
Right.
And their experiences highlight the real pressures and potential for harm within these communities.
And then there's this whole idea of the hypermasculinity that's so prevalent within this radical Christian conservatism.
Right.
The sources suggest that it's almost a compensation for the submission that's required of men within the church hierarchy.
It's like they're overcompensating for their perceived lack of power in one sphere by asserting it in another.
Right, exactly. And this very rigid binary worldview guidance, saved, unsaved.
It seeks to eliminate any nuance, any ambiguity.
Yeah.
It offers certainty in a world that can feel very chaotic and complex.
And the condemnation of homosexuality as this kind of perversion, a tool of Satan, stems directly from this binary thinking.
Right.
And figures like James Dobson have played a huge role in promoting this extreme version of family values, and this very hierarchical power structure.
Yeah, conditioning children to be dependent on external authority and to distrust anyone outside their immediate circle.
It creates what they call an exclusive and intolerant comradeship.
Yeah, where judgment is based on obedience rather than inherent worth or compassion.
And then there's this fear of love as a force that could potentially undermine the control of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Which really speaks to the movement's obsession with maintaining its power dynamics.
And this is further illustrated by the wealth and influence of these televangelists.
Right.
They often operate like these despotic potentates, which mirrors the hierarchical society that they're advocating for.
But the sources do acknowledge that many people within this movement are genuinely sincere and willing to make sacrifices,
right?
Even to the point of justifying the disempowerment of those who don't believe what they believe.
Yeah, it's a complex mix of motivations.
And there's this disconnect between the movement's elite leadership and the general membership,
which reinforces the top-down nature of the control structure.
So let's move on to the movement's relationship with truth and science.
Okay.
This is where the whole rejection of objective truth really comes into focus.
Right.
They often treat factual information as just another opinion.
Yeah.
And this creates this situation where interpretations of a divinely inspired text can actually trump established scientific knowledge.
The Creation Museum is a perfect example of this. It's a very sophisticated blending of modern technology with a very literal interpretation of creation.
Right.
And their ongoing attacks on the theory of evolution.
Right.
And their push to promote creationism and intelligent design in schools are really key battlegrounds in this conflict.
And it's fascinating how they actually use what seems like scientific language and methodology to argue for creationism.
Right.
They've established these parallel research institutions, and they publish what they claim is evidence against mainstream science.
The goal is to establish the Bible as the unquestionable word of God.
Right, the sole arbiter of truth.
Exactly.
And this extends to their attack on any scientific findings that challenge their fundamentalist worldview.
Yeah, whether it's research on climate change, AIDS, or reproductive health, they're actively lobbying to defund related programs, and they systematically try to discredit or censor any data that conflicts with their beliefs.
And the work of people like John Whitcomb, who promotes creationism and tells educators that they have scientific ammunition, is really telling. They completely dismiss the conclusions of secular scientists as inherently biased.
It's like they can't even conceive of the possibility that someone outside their framework could be objective.
It's this total lack of trust in any knowledge that comes from outside their very specific worldview.
And it goes so far as to portray dinosaurs as initially docile and gentle creatures.
Oh, wow.
Blaming the idea of them being carnivorous on anti-God movies.
It's like they're creating their own alternate reality.
Yeah, and they even encourage students in secular universities to hide their creationist beliefs.
It highlights how incompatible their worldview is with mainstream scientific thought.
Yeah, it's like they see it as a threat to their entire belief system.
So we also see this kind of fusion of the prosperity gospel with celebrity culture, where wealth, fame, and power become signs of God's favor.
Right.
And figures like James Dobson and Pat Robertson are really key in mobilizing conservative Christians around these political agendas.
It's important to understand the historical roots of this ideology. We can trace it back to earlier movements like the Christian Nationalist Crusade and the John Birch Society, with their strong anti-communist views and their embrace of conspiracy theories.
Right.
They use media very effectively to spread this narrative of a culture that's been taken over by secular forces.
They constantly call for Christians to take action.
Right, to reclaim their rightful place in society.
And then there's their relationship with Israel, which is quite complex.
Right.
You have groups like the Jerusalem Connection, this whole thing with Bus 19.
Yeah.
It's something that often makes even people in Israel feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's a sense that their motivations are not always genuine.
It's like they're using these affiliations to serve their own ideological goals.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the bigger picture here.
Okay.
What kind of threat does this movement pose to an open society?
Well, one of the most dangerous things is this us versus them mentality they create.
Right.
Where your primary moral obligation is to other Christians.
Yeah.
It divides the world into allies and enemies.
And there's this belief in their own immunity to evil.
Right.
They project all negativity onto these external enemies.
Which leads to this really dangerous logic where they can justify the elimination of those enemies in the name of moral purification.
It's a very slippery slope.
And we also have to be concerned about the gradual infiltration of these extremist ideologies into an open society.
Especially when people aren't paying attention.
Exactly. And they're very good at exploiting any gaps in resistance.
And we see this with their efforts to establish these parallel Christian organizations that are meant to replace existing secular institutions.
It's a very deliberate attempt to reshape society in their image.
And then there's the huge enthusiasm and support for any political candidate who gets endorsed by the movement.
Right. It shows how much influence they wield.
And then there's the stated character movement with its emphasis on externally imposed moral and political authority.
It raises concerns about a slide towards a more authoritarian system where any dissent is seen as heresy.
And the rhetoric employed by figures like Rod Parsley against groups like Islam.
Yeah, demonizing them as this anti-Christ religion and calling for war against demons is incredibly dangerous. It's just fueling division and hatred.
And then you have all this religious paraphernalia being sold, promising financial and physical healing.
It's pure exploitation.
And the prosperity gospel, promoted by networks like TBN, where wealth is equated with God's blessing.
Yeah. Often amidst accusations of financial mismanagement.
Right, blurring the lines between faith and commerce.
And these dramatic conversion stories and testimonials on religious broadcasting are designed to evoke these emotional responses and encourage financial contributions.
It's a very powerful combination.
And the prosperity gospel aligns perfectly with neoconservative goals of dismantling government programs and regulations.
So it's not just about religion, it's about a very specific political and economic agenda.
Right.
And then there's their interpretation of the Genesis dominion mandate, which they see as a directive for Bible-believing Christians to take control over America and the world.
Yeah, they advocate for unrestricted capitalism.
Right.
And they demonize taxes.
It provides a theological justification for their political and economic beliefs.
Exactly. And when you have communities facing economic hardship and social breakdown, this theology of despair can really take root.
Right.
They find solace in these apocalyptic visions, which just reinforces the movement's sense of urgency.
And then you have figures like Tim LaHaye and Gary Fraser who are predicting the end times.
Right.
Fostering this feeling that we're living in the final days and that we need to separate ourselves from the crumbling world.
And they demonize various groups as enemies who need to be defeated in order for Christ to return.
It all reinforces that us versus them dynamic.
Yeah.
And then there's the call to dismantle the separation of church and state.
Which is a direct attack on one of the core principles of an open society.
And their recruitment process often involves isolating new converts from their previous lives.
It's about controlling information and limiting their exposure to alternative viewpoints.
It's a very effective way to maintain control.
And the historical warnings of figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Paul Tillich about the dangers of passive religious piety in the face of rising intolerance are incredibly relevant today.
It's a reminder that we can't just sit back and assume that everything will be okay.
We had to be vigilant.
So one of the key takeaways from this material is that human history is shaped by these clashes of belief systems.
Yeah, it's not just a simple battle between religion and secularism.
Right, it's much more nuanced than that.
And we have to recognize the vital role that democracy plays in protecting religious freedom and individual autonomy from these totalitarian impulses.
It's a bulwark against oppression.
And we have historical examples that we can learn from the suppression of labor movements under Italian fascism to fictional portrayals of dictatorships that are backed by religious authority.
And Vice President Henry Wallace's 1944 definition of an American fascist is still chillingly relevant today.
It shows that these dangers are always present.
We can't afford to be complacent.
And there will always be bigotry and resentment within democratic societies.
Right.
Feelings that can be manipulated and exploited.
And there's this really important warning. If we don't actively defend kindness and compassion, we create a space for harmful ideologies to flourish.
It's a call to action.
Absolutely.
You have to be willing to engage critically with religious texts, recognizing that they can contain diverse and sometimes problematic content.
And it's crucial to maintain respect and tolerance in dialogue.
Yeah, without those qualities, democracy itself starts to erode.
And the conclusion that the sources draw is pretty stark.
Yeah.
They argue that the radical Christian right embodies elements of a Christian fascism.
And that it poses a very real threat to an open society.
Especially in times of crisis.
Exactly. We have to be actively and aggressively defending tolerance and pluralism.
You know, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
Exploring how information gets interpreted and used, and how it shapes worldviews. If you're interested in diving deeper into this, and particularly looking at the power of audio narratives, you might find Mindful Moments and our podcasts on YouTube interesting.
Yeah, it's a really insightful resource.
It's an AI-powered audiobook analysis channel that can really help you understand the structures and messages within the audio content you consume.
Absolutely.
So, to leave you with a final thought, I want you to consider the immense power of interpretation.
Yeah.
How the same source material can be used to build vastly different, often opposing worldviews. Understanding those underlying frameworks and motivations is absolutely essential for navigating our increasingly complex information landscape.
It's more important than ever.
So if you found this exploration thought-provoking, please consider subscribing and sharing this episode. You can find a link to purchase the book we discussed in the show notes. And most importantly, keep thinking critically about the information you encounter.